Hello, welcome to everybody. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. It's great to see so many people here today on this hot and humid day, and hope you're bearing the heat and enjoying all the World Cup. And you're off today, okay. And take a break to come to a session here that I think is extremely important and extremely timely. One of the few things I think there's a consensus about in this country that everybody recognizes is that the immigration system that we have doesn't work very well. It's broken and it needs to be fixed. I think a few people that would dispute that. At the same time, it's very, very clear that it's been very difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a coherent immigration policy, which reveals how dysfunctional and how divided our politics in this country have become today. From the day he announced his candidacy for the President of the United States, Donald Trump has made a hardline policy, immigration policy, a signature issue of his campaign, and arguably was the most important factor that propelled him to the White House in January 2017. His main pledge, above all other issues, was to tackle illegal immigration. He's made decisions to end DACA and temporary protection status, and of course the travel ban, which was recently upheld by the Supreme Court. In the name of enforcing existing immigration law, the Trump administration has adopted a zero tolerance policy, meaning that every person caught crossing the border illegally would be referred for federal prosecution on criminal charges and sent to detention centers awaiting trial. The painful consequences of this approach and this policy were on display with the separation of over 2,300 children from the parents since early May, since minors cannot be kept in federal criminal detention facilities. The dramatic and the heartbreaking, heart-wrenching images of children staying inside cage-like metal fences prompted public outcry and outrage. And through an executive order, President Trump reversed himself and backtracked on the policy. But the problem persists, with many children still separated from families, and there's been a striking lack of preparation and planning for how to handle the growing influx seeking asylum, principally from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Yesterday, on his visit to Guatemala and meeting with the presidents of the Northern Triangle countries, Vice President Pence warned potential migrants to respect U.S. borders and sought to encourage leaders to educate their people about the dangers of migrating to the United States. Today, we're going to explore the political, legal, and foreign policy implications of what is happening on this critical issue. The dialogue has long focused on immigration, which has been one of the persistent challenges and irritants in U.S.-Latin American relations for decades, and has been a prominent feature of many of our policy reports over the years. Fortunately, today we have three leading experts to help us better understand the complexities of the current situation, as well as think about realistic solutions and the best way to move forward constructively in what I think we all agree is a very difficult and challenging political environment. Angie Kelly is a senior strategic advisor for immigration at the Open Society Foundations, focuses on policies and the politics of immigration, previously served at the Center for American Progress with a variety of positions, including senior vice president. And in 2004, she served as a White House advisor on Immigration Executive Actions. Angie got her law degree from George Washington University. She is the daughter of South American immigrants from Bolivia, and we welcome her back to the dialogue, so thank you. Sandra Grossman is the managing partner and founder of Grossman Law. She is a highly experienced litigator, represented clients in diverse areas of immigration law before the immigration courts, the Board of Immigration Appeals, and the federal district courts. She is also an adjunct professor on immigration law at the Washington College of Law at American University, and she publishes frequently on the topic. She is a graduate of Georgetown University Law School, and she also once worked at the Inter-American Dialogue. It's kind of buried in your resume, but I wanted to sort of bring that to the surface if I could. So it's great to have Sandra with us today. And finally, we have Manuel Orozco, who directs the Dialogues program on migration, remittances, and development. In addition to being a well-known authority on remittance flows, Manuel has taken the lead at the Dialogue on immigration issues. He's published widely on the issue, has testified before Congress. He also serves as the chair of the Central American and Caribbean at the U.S. Foreign Service Institute and has affiliations with Harvard University and Georgetown University. He has his PhD from political science from the University of Texas at Austin, and I want to thank him for his direction and his leadership at the Dialogue on these issues, including organizing today's meeting. So thank you, Manuel. Let me kind of, just we're going to have a conversation. I'll ask a few questions, and then I see there are a lot of people in this room with a lot of expertise and a lot of interest in this issue, so then we'll then open it up and have a good exchange. I'm going to start with Angie, if I can, and maybe you could help us help us understand the politics of this issue. Most polls show that most Americans have favorable views of immigrants or sympathetic. Certainly the Dreamers, there's a huge amount of support for the Dreamers. Why has it been so hard to come up with a solution to try to address all of these problems? If the polls are on one side in the country, why is kind of the politics so messy? Maybe you can just review a little bit of the landscape of the politics to help understand where we are and why it's been so frustrating.
Got it. I'll do that, and I'll also, can you guys hear me? Good. I'll also put this in a policy context because the policy and the politics are so intertwined. But first off, let me just say thank you. It is wonderful to be here. And what's more wonderful is really that you all are here and expressing such an interest in this very painful topic at an unprecedented time in our nation's history, where we are taking children from their parents. So it is really more important than the four of us up here is all of you out there and what you're able to do with the information that you hear today, because that's the only way we will have change. The context of what's happening today at the border with children being taken from their mothers and fathers isn't a surprise. As Michael indicated, there was, from the moment Trump announced his candidacy, a clear indication that he was going to be zeroing in on immigrants and on refugees. And sure enough, soon after being sworn in, there were a number of executive orders that he put forward, because this is an area of law where the executive branch has a lot of authority, right? They can make a lot of policy changes, and Congress doesn't, frankly, have much ability to stop it. So we've seen some really important trends that I just want to put out there so that you've got that context. One is that we have over 100% increase in arrests of people who are undocumented with no criminal background, who've been here for many years, who have U.S. citizen children, who before were not a priority for being arrested. So that is a pool of low-hanging fruit that this administration is going after, that in previous administrations hadn't been a priority. The second trend that we've seen is that this administration is very determined to grow the number of undocumented people. And so you mentioned the Dreamers, for example, many of whom, 700 and some thousand, have DACA, work authorization, that Attorney General Sessions ended last September. So their fate is right now being held up by basically chewing gum in the court. So there's an injunction that keeps them protected, but at any point, that could be cut. There's also a lot of people who have something called temporary protected status. It's about 300,000 people. Some of them have been here since before 1999 from different countries. And these are people who have time and time again gone in, paid their fees, undergone background checks, much like the young people with DACA. And each one of the nations that has their nationals have temporary protected status, Haiti, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, they're all been eliminated. So we have another 300,000 people that are going to eventually become targets for this administration to put in an ever bigger pool of undocumented folks. The second trend, or third trend, now I've lost track of my numbers. The next trend is a clear vision of this administration's future policy on legal immigration. And that is one domain where this administration has to go to Congress to change legal immigration family categories and the numbers of visas that are given to people. And the administration has shown its hand on what it wants to do during last spring's DREAM debate that was tied up in a congressional budget battle. And there what we saw is that the administration wants to cut many of the family immigrant categories, wants to cut diversity visas, which is a way that people come to this country who come from countries that otherwise don't have a lot of folks here, many from Africa. Dramatically scaling back on refugee numbers, which is something that is within this administration's domain. So that did not become law. The effort by the administration last spring to push that was met with severe resistance by Democrats and some Republicans. But it shows very clearly what this administration is like adding up to and what it wants in terms of who is going to be allowed to be here, who's allowed to come in. And I think, frankly, it is as much about the racial composition in an effort to change that. And we can talk more about that in the context of the conversation. So it's absolutely true that legal immigration, that the Dreamers, that these sympathetic groups have very high support among the American public. But as I like to say, it is a mile wide, but an inch deep. And I think the reason is, in part, it's very complex, is that we're holding messages that are in tension with each other, right? So on the one hand are feelings that are in tension with one another. So on the one hand, people very much relate to that lovely woman who was an immigrant from Cochabamba, Bolivia, who I've known forever, and surely she's doing great things for this country and she's contributing. But at the same time, I'm hearing images of immigrants that are MS-13 members, that are animals, that are invaders, and that is the tension that I think Americans then look to lawmakers to say, help, what's the solution? And you run into the paralysis in Congress. So I think that, in part, this moment around family separation, which is transcending any congressional battle that I've ever seen, and I've unfortunately been a part of many of them, I think that may begin to call the question, really, about, what do we want to do as compassionate Americans, right? We can find a solution, right? We don't have to take babies from their mothers, and we don't have to then or put them in jails together. If we have people who are coming, who have a credible fear of persecution in this country, they have a legal right to apply for asylum, surely we are a smart enough country that we can make sure that they get their fair day in court, that they have access to counsel, like the wise woman to my right here, and we can judge whether or not they're meeting those criteria. That's been the aspiration. Now, that criteria for asylum is another thing that this administration has also been narrowing. So when I think about what are the smart policy solutions that I imagine the American public would nod their head and say, yeah, that makes sense. The difference is this administration. And whether I would trust that notion of how do you fairly have asylum adjudicated in this country under President Obama, President Bush, very different than under President Trump. It's vexing for at least the next few years. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Sandra, let's talk, if you could tell us a little more about the legal kind of strategies, approaches that you've been in this field for a long time. You know it better than anyone. And what is kind of this current situation of zero tolerance? What has that meant in terms of your legal approach to try to respond to the situation?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that I want to say is piggybacking a little bit on what you talked about is that for the people that are arriving at the border, seeking asylum is not a criminal act. I mean, I think that's something that the American public has been confused about or made to be confused about. The right to seek asylum is protected in our domestic laws, which is founded upon international law, such as the United Nations Refugee Convention and the protocols following the convention. And what the domestic law establishes is that people that arrive at our borders who are characterized as refugees, which means that they are either unwilling or unable to return to their home country because of either past persecution or a reasonable fear of future persecution, either because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or their membership in a particular social group. Those people under U.S. laws have the clear right to ask for asylum. And the process is one that's been established. They can go to a Customs and Border Protection officer. They can express a fear of persecution, and then there's a very clearly delineated process through which they get a credible fear interview. Once they get that credible fear interview, if they pass it, they are then placed into removal proceedings by the Department of Homeland Security, and then they have the right to present their case before an immigration judge. Unfortunately, because of our very broken immigration system, we have a backlog of over 700,000 cases right now, pending before the Executive Office of Immigration Review, which is part of the Department of Justice. And another point that you made that I think is very important is that the main attorney in our country, Attorney General Sessions, has used his authority to recall some very key cases, for example, matter of AB, and he uses those cases to bring back or to change the laws, the well-established precedent that gave, for example, women and children who were fleeing abuse in their home countries the right to apply for asylum here. So he's recalling those cases and in that sense very much abrogating people's rights to apply for asylum. So that's the first kind of mix of issues that we have. In terms of what's happening at the border, I think the real tragedy is that this new executive order, which ends the family separation crisis, and I say end because the executive order really leaves a lot of room for the government to actually continue separating children from their parents. Specifically, it says that family unity will be maintained where appropriate and consistent with available resources. So I think, as we all know, the White House's commitment to keeping families together is tenuous at best, and that language is very concerning. But it replaces this family separation with family togetherness in the context of criminal and immigration detention. So, and we have been here before there are many differences between the administration, but under President Obama, he also instituted a family detention policy. I had the opportunity in 2014 to visit a family detention center. I spent a week there with lawyers from the American Immigration Council and the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and we provided free legal services to women and children that were fleeing mostly from Central America and had ended up in these detention centers. And I can tell you, Michael, that I didn't meet one woman there who had come to the United States by choice. In other words, they had made this trek across the desert facing all kinds of unbelievable, situations because they had no choice. And they were fleeing from issues that I'm sure Manuel will talk about, like drug trafficking, gang-based violence, forced recruitment of their children, and domestic violence. So I think, as lawyers these days, our reputation is getting a little bit better because people are starting to realize that at this point we're kind of on the front lines. We had a tremendous announcement this week by Justice Kennedy, which I think has the potential of impacting the immigration debate in a way that can make a real difference, and in terms of the laws and this check on the presidential power. So we're doing what we can on the ground to hold the government accountable.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. Manuel, I have a sense of deja vu. If anybody else does, but we went through this a couple of years ago about the I guess it was 2014, unaccompanied children on the border, and everybody all of a sudden said, let's talk about root causes and why they're leaving, and cited many of the factors that Sandra just cited, and that led to a major aid cooperation for Central America. And now all of a sudden, this is happening. Everybody's saying, let's look at root causes, and again. And so this is kind of the sense that we already went through that. Can you just tell us a little bit? Do you agree with Sandra that a lot of people are being forced? It's obviously a complex set of factors, and they kind of overlap, and it's sometimes hard to sort of distinguish them. But there's also grinding poverty, lack of economic opportunities that you've written about a lot, and this credible fear interview that Sandra talked about. Is that what's driving most people in the research you've done to leave and come to the United States? And also, do you think that Vice President Pence's warning will be a deterrence, will have any effect on those who are seeking to come to the U.S.?
Vice President Biden also made the same warning. Even though he supported the Alliance for Prosperity, he also made the same warning. There were TV ads since 2014 paid by U.S. embassies in the Northern Triangle, and they didn't have the intended effect. But I think, the current moment is one in which we are at a situation where there is a real and cruel disconnect between the facts and the political rhetoric. The political rhetoric, why are we where we are right now, is informed by the very inadequate complexities of the bureaucratic policy process in administering migration policy. But it's also shaped by a very risk-averse Congress when it comes to dealing with immigration policy. This is why we don't have any immigration reform since 1986. But the factor that really made the tipping point to all this is an anti-immigration rhetoric that came from the powers that be today. And it's an I call it reactionary nativism, that basically wants a model of national identity that doesn't exist in U.S. political culture, but is being imposed through basically policy and by force. So that situation leads to statements like the ones Vice President Pence made. One of them, and perhaps the most important one that reflects the entire policy process and decisions of this administration, is the assumption that people entering the United States are criminals, los bad hombres. And that has been a matter of consistency since the campaign. And it was manifested yesterday. Vice President Pence said, don't come, because if you try, you're not going to make it. And not only don't come, but the fact is that people applying for asylum, in the majority of cases, are actually not representing a credible fact. The reality is twofold. On the one hand, when it comes to practice, even when we look at the asylum adjudication process, the over 80% applications for asylum are considered credible by the Department of Justice. And the applications, even though they have increased by nearly 2,000%, they're actually following more or less the same adjudication rate of 20%. So the vice president can say one thing, but even the practice from the administration shows that there are credible fears of persecution. The reality shows you the same thing. We just hand out this piece of paper, and you know, you can, it's a way to summarize basically these facts. Central America in particular, you know, 70% of asylum adjudications come from the Northern Triangle. But this is a region that has at least 100,000 gang members operating in the entire Northern Triangle, a region of 30 million people. It's a region where political instability is widespread. Guatemala is a country basically that is being in a turmoil and in the brink of another resignation and removal of its president, and it's not removed because the political establishment doesn't know what to do with another resignation of another president. It's a region that is controlled by 10 cartels that handle 500 tons of cocaine, that manage a network of at least 5,000 gun-for-hire people that are responsible for 16,000 homicides a year in the Northern Triangle. So under these circumstances, it doesn't sound like you are in a happy place in the Northern Triangle. But then we looked at, we actually, through our research, we have created data looking at homicides by municipality in the 3 countries. And we find that a 1% increase in homicides in Central America increases migration by 100%. So there is, and this is where, you know, you talk about the complexities of these issues. There is a driving force in Central America, and that is that there is basically a kind of an ecosystem of organized crime that is ruling economics and politics. Now, organized crime has different forms. One is 10 drug cartels, and they have destabilized Central America. But you also have all established political elites that are unable to exercise democratic authority. And so they have been sequestered by corruption practices in such a way that the citizens are not able to really trust their governments from protecting them. I mean, El Salvador is a very good case study. I mean, the official figure is about 60,000 gangs, a country of 6 million people. That means 1 in 100 people is a gang member. That means that there is a gang member in at least in the vicinity of my block. So if you include to that extortion, the official figure of extortions amounts to about 6,000 a year. But the numbers are far greater than that. El Salvador published a report, Fusades, that showed that 60% of businesses, small businesses, that comprise 90% of all businesses, have suffered from extortion. So, you know, the facts are that you live in an ecosystem of organized crime and in a context of fear. Within the context where you have migrants in the United States who see on a day-to-day basis the news that someone was killed, someone was extorted, that your president is going to be removed very soon, or the president of Honduras is an illegitimate ruler, or, you know, look at Nicaragua, what's going on right now, you're going to vote with your feet. And you can't ignore the fact that there is a problem of co-responsibility, of shared responsibility when we're dealing with transshipment of drugs that come to the United States and are consumed on this side of the border. They are responsible for the presence of these drug cartels, but the realities are there.
Great, thank you. I'd like to ask a question of Angie and maybe Sandra and just follow up. You know, Angie, you especially talked about how this is part of a larger sort of plan that the administration is pursuing sort of step by step, and you pointed to different. And that suggests that this is from in terms of the policy that they want to pursue, it's done in a sort of being done in a competent way.
I didn't say that.
No, I'm saying that. I'm saying that because it sounds like there is a kind of there's a rationale. There's a, and yet at the same time you have all of these reports, and Sandra talked about this a little bit about just the lack of preparation, lack of zero tolerance. What does that mean? And you're just totally ill-equipped and inadequate to deal with this issue. I mean, in some ways you have this kind of at least thinking through whether you criticize it or don't. And yet there seems to be no thinking through in terms of on the ground, how to set things up to make this what the broader policy kind of work on the ground. How do you reconcile those, or how do you see that?
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job describing it. Having worked in the White House in 2014, not 2004, I really got to see up close the thoughtfulness, the complexity, the deliberation that went into an executive branch idea, policy, and then being implemented, right? And everything was well documented, and the right people were brought in the room, and it was incredibly thought through. And none of those habits and practices from, my limited time with this one administration am I seeing in this administration. And now I think this policy in particular is really shining a spotlight on this policy is being driven, and, this is not news, by the West Wing, by Steve Miller, who is the head of the Domestic Policy Council within the White House. And these are ideas that, he's a former Senator Sessions staffer when the Attorney General was a senator. So I think it is a pretty small group of people, but who have the ear of the president, and this president and how he operates is very different than Barack Obama. And so it can be the case that there will be a tweet that will then dictate policy from up here, but there's no sense of rational thought about how it's going to be implemented. So where that leaves us today is that we have hundreds of children who are under the age, with tender age, is that 7, 12, right?
Yeah, 12.
Right? I mean, some that are babies. They're nonverbal. They're nonverbal. And we don't know who their parent is. The parent doesn't know where they are. That is a policy of child abuse. Child abuse. And that is this administration's policy. They didn't think about how they were going to be able to keep track of the parent and the child. They didn't think to take their pictures. They didn't think to put A numbers in, alien registration numbers in correctly. They didn't think. And the consequence is disastrous. And that's not just because I'm an advocate. It's because I have heard and I have seen people who are pediatricians, social workers, psychologists, who are with these children, and the lasting damage is incalculable. So yeah, they didn't think it through.
Sandra?
If I can just
please.
add to that, one side of this which is incredibly important is the humanitarian side, but the other thing that they seem to have forgotten was actually the law, right? So when you have,
Detail.
right, just a little detail that seems to have been overlooked. So when you have Attorney General Sessions citing scripture for the proposition that tearing a child away from their mother is allowable, then you know that there's a problem, right? Because there is well-established law since the late 1990s that children may not be kept in detention for more than a certain amount of time. It's this Flores settlement agreement that the government is now trying to abrogate. So that's one thing they forgot about in terms of the law. The other thing is the Constitution. So it's well established in Supreme Court precedent that people that are inside the United States, unlike, for example, people that are subject to the travel ban who are outside of the country, the people that are here have a right to due process. And that's what the court in the Southern District of California this week decided when it issued a preliminary injunction against the family separation policy. And what the court cited to was the Fifth Amendment. And it decided that the individuals that are being separated from their children have a great likelihood of success in a merits case because they have a right to family integrity. So again, citing to scripture, not really in the American tradition.
Have you, in your view, have the courts been a good sort of check and responded to this crisis? Have you been encouraged by that, or you think they could be, play a stronger role?
Right. So, and again, there's different levels of courts here. I think at the local level, so we practice before the immigration courts, which are part of the Executive Office of Immigration Review. Here locally, we have an immigration court in Virginia and one in Baltimore. And so what the studies have found and what we have found in our office is then that when people are represented by counsel, they have a much greater likelihood of success before the courts. Mm-hmm. Now, the studies that have been done on the Executive Office of Immigration Review show that there are patterns within certain courts. So if you look at the court in Atlanta, I think you have like less than a 10% chance of getting an asylum case approved, at a great difference, say, with a court here in Baltimore. So there are some tremendous discrepancies, and the Department of Justice has just issued criteria for the immigration judges where they're supposed to be fast-tracking cases right now, and that's been met with a great amount of frustration and backlash by the immigration judges themselves, because there's a recognition that they're already under a tremendous amount of pressure to adjudicate cases quickly, and then when that happens, the due process concerns are serious. But then when you look at the larger issues like the travel ban, you've seen the lower courts, the federal district courts really enjoin those policies. And then, of course, this week we had the decision in Hawaii v. Trump on the travel ban case, ultimately deciding that the president has tremendous authority to create immigration policy and to exclude large numbers of people from the United States. And I think this decision will further embolden the Trump administration.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have a question for Angie, and then a final question for Manuel, and then we're going to open it up to your comments and questions. Angie, just along the lines of building on Sandra's point about sort of the reaction to courts at different levels, can you give us your perspective about the advocacy side and sort of the reactions, and also comment on any potential kind of leadership or championing of this in terms of the politics, either political figures in Congress or outside of Congress, and making it different. Obviously, in this case, when Trump sort of went back, the letter of the first lady, former first ladies,
right,
was something.
Bush, yep.
In other words, and even though Sandra said it didn't, the executive order itself has some problems with it. It's not what we wanted. It still represented a sort of pulling back a little bit from where they had gone. So we've seen some evidence that could work. Mm-hmm. Can you just expand a little bit on what you think could work moving forward in terms of pushing back on this?
Sure. Yeah. So a couple parts to your question. Let's start with that moment where this wasn't a political issue, and it was people who care and who want these children to be with their moms and dads, and didn't like the fact our government was taking children away, where you saw evangelical leaders coming forward, you saw Republican senators saying, please stop this, former First Lady Laura Bush. I mean, this is an issue that is about us as people, us as parents, right? I'm really proud of the fact that my parents are immigrants, but I'm even prouder of the fact that I've got two amazing daughters. And I think that connection is something that transcends whether there's a D or an R after your name. So I do think that this could lend itself if we just let the politicians not be politicians. I always like to say that if they could vote anonymously on comprehensive immigration reform, woof, it would have passed a long time ago. All right? So I think that building on the notion that we are a caring people, that we know that there are alternatives to detention, where we have seen that people show up for court, right? They're there for their day in court. Kind, which is a terrific organization, Kids in Need of Defense, has done pilot programs that have like a 97% rate of people showing up who are not being held in detention. They're not jailing moms and dads and their kids. So I think like there are alternatives. To your terrific point about what happens when you have a lawyer. Shocking. Better to be in court with a lawyer than without one. Right? I wouldn't let my kid go to a traffic court without an attorney. We're going to have 12-year-olds trying to explain why their mom and dad and they fled their country without an attorney. So I think that's another possibility. I think that the connection of these conversations of what are the root causes, what is happening in the countries that are sending people here. It's a shared responsibility. You said that, and that's absolutely brilliant. It's not just the U.S., right? And I think when you start speaking to the American public in those really concrete terms about like, okay, here and now, we can have control. We can give people a fair day in court, judge their cases, keep families together, and be a compassionate country. And at the same time, we can also think longer term. We can think about how do we help stabilize those countries. They don't want to leave home. They don't want to move. They're being pushed out. And I think like that's something that Americans could get behind. Right? The advocacy around this has been unprecedented. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of people who are going to be filling the streets, carrying signs here tomorrow between 11 and 2 o'clock. Hope you all can be there. Bring water bottles. There's going to be events like that are going to have hundreds of thousands of people in Chicago, San Antonio, Los Angeles, New York, and then hundreds of other sister actions, right? That got stood up like that. There's one group, Raíces in Texas, that nobody knew about a month ago. And they now have how many? $18 million? Yeah. $18 million that people were here. You're a legal group. You're going to help these kids. That's America. That's this country. And I think we're looking for leadership that can say that. That's not about the D. It's not about the R, right? It's about this is a caring country, and we can do better.
Thank you. Let me turn to Manuel for the last question, and then I'm going to open it up to you. Manuel, Vice President Biden wrote, who was really the architect of the Alliance for Prosperity, wrote recently in an op-ed, I think in the Washington Post, that that the Alliance for Prosperity, even though it's been in effect for just a few years, has actually shown some results in Central America, that there have been declines in violence that everybody talks about. They're off the charts, and they are extremely high, but they've been going down a little bit. Do you see that, if you could sustain that, and of course this administration has cut the level from 750 to, I think, 600, a little over 600 million, and that's partly because Congress is still a bipartisan commitment to this in Congress. But do you see that kind of effort yielding results over the long time, or do you think something else needs to be done, and done here and also done in the region?
I think the Alliance for Prosperity was this development strategy that was recommended by the Central American governments who asked the president of the Inter-American Development Bank to craft a development approach to the region. And it was, in reality, fully funded by the United States, which is, there are certain realities that need to be recognized. And that is that it's being U.S. foreign economic assistance, the one that has been more consistent over a lot of the problems that affect Central America. So the shared responsibility has been partly taken. Unfortunately, the alliance, the approach is, to a large extent, an old wine in a new bottle, in the sense that on the economic side, it has components that deal with investing in agriculture, in tourism, in basically economic activities that are one of the powerful reasons of why people are migrating, because these are economic activities that do not generate enough wealth. People basically are living on less than $200 a month in a region that you need to live on at least $500. So that is a trigger factor of migration. The detonating factor is insecurity. But in that sense, the Alliance of Prosperity hasn't provided all the right solutions for the root causes of this problem. There is this ecosystem of organized crime is competing with the productive sector of the local economy because it doesn't generate enough wealth. So that's one thing. And yes and no, homicides has slightly dropped. They have dropped from 14 homicides a day 2 years ago to 11 or 12. Now, you can be the judge as to what does that mean. In statistical terms, it will mean that 1%, if 1% increase in homicides led to 100% in migration in 2016, it will mean that now it's 75% increase in migration. So if you look at the numbers that are in this paper, in the third box, you'll see that migration has actually slowed down a little bit, but people continue to leave. Central American migration represents today the third largest wave of migration. And 2 years ago, it was the second largest wave of migration in the world after the Syrian crisis. Now is the second wave is Venezuelan, which is also being ignored at this point. But unfortunately, the Alliance for Prosperity is not providing all the results. And I think it's a politician's choice to come up with something and put it on the table. And when it comes to compliance, the Central American governments, with all the respect to the governments and the leaders, they haven't really complied to it. Because part of the commitment was that they were going to match the same amount of funding that they will get from the United States or from any other donor. But the reality is that 99% of the $700 million come from the USA. And what they did was to relabel their budget lines. So if you have, for example, education in secondary school, they call it Education for the Alliance for Prosperity in Secondary School. But still today, the number of children that are living in Central America in the Northern Triangle is higher than the annual increase of matriculation in high school. So, there is no prosperity still taking place. And to put it more simply, Central America, the Northern Triangle grew by 3.5% last year. That means that the average income increased from $200 to $201 a month.
Can I just one quick follow-up, and then I promise I'll get to you. There are elections on, no one's mentioned the word Mexico here, but to go from Central America to come here, you have to go through Mexico. And Mexico's having elections on Sunday. It looks like López Obrador is going to be the next president of Mexico. Probably hard to know what will change, if anything, but do you have any sort of sense of what, based on what he's talked about, that we might expect in terms of Mexico's role?
I mean, López Obrador will have a difficult time changing the policy right now. The Mexican government has sort of a duplicitous policy so far. They try to stop as many Central Americans as they can. If at the U.S. border we have detained or apprehended about 100,000 people a year ago, the Mexican authorities detained at least 100,000 too. And they have kept that policy, even though the Senate in 2010, the Mexican Senate passed a law saying that Central Americans actually had the right of transit to the U.S. If he wants to confront the Trump administration, he can try to say, people are free to flow. But the reality is that politics is politics, and I don't see López Obrador changing that approach to what the current government is doing.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're going to open it up. We have, I should announce it at the dialogue, we have a zero tolerance policy for long-winded interventions. So please keep...
but not deportations.
Please keep your questions brief, and you're free to make comments, and you don't have to disguise them as questions. You can just make them as a comment, but please be brief. So please identify yourselves, and we'll try to get everybody involved in this conversation, which I think has been very interesting for a while. We're going to take a round. We'll start with this gentleman, and then we'll go over here. Just take 2 or 3, and then we'll come back.
Sam Delano with the Osgood Center for International Studies, and I'm just wondering, Vox released a report today that said that Sessions and the DOJ are planning legislation that will ban asylum for any person coming from Central America that is accused of illegal entry and processed for illegal entry. Is there a legal basis to do this? And if so, what are we going to do with all these extra people that are not going to be processed?
Okay, thank you. We'll go back to you, Sandra, but let's take some of, yes, here. No, be in front of you, the gentleman.
Okay. Is this on?
Yes.
Vic Johnson. 2 quick comments. The first one, which isn't the main one, is just to point out that we do tend to say fairly repeatedly and assume that we're in a situation where Congress can't do anything about immigration, but that's not exactly correct. Congress doesn't really want to do anything about immigration. I mean, I think the reality is, Angie will correct me if I'm wrong, we would have passed comprehensive immigration reform 5 years ago, which is exactly why Boehner didn't let it come up for a vote, because he didn't want it to happen. There was a resolution circulated through the House, as you all know, recently that would have made an order a series of votes on 4 different immigration measures covering the entire spectrum, which, if that had been allowed, one of those at least would have passed. The Republican leadership desperately fought off that resolution because it knew that, and it knew that what would pass wouldn't be their bill. So what you really have is a Congress that controlled by a party that's afraid to do anything because it gives its most radical anti-immigration wing a veto over what is done. So I think that's a more accurate description of what Congress does. I wanted to focus really quickly, though, on another question. I think on our side of the debate, we tend to underplay what I think most people in their guts would feel is the reality that the more civilized policy you present toward people who want to come here, the more you do encourage them to come. And the tougher you are, the more of a disincentive it is. Now, we on our side tend to, I think quite correctly, emphasize the morality of this whole thing. And it's very good to keep on the high road here of the morality argument. But ultimately, we need to, it seems to me, confront this question people have. Can we secure the border in a humane way? Or is it a case where if I want to be virtuous, I'll support these guys sitting here in the dialogue today, but if I want to protect the country, I'll go with Trump. And if you bifurcate it that way, people are going to go the other way just because they know somehow there have to be limits. Angie started to address that in her comments, but I think we all need to be more systematic about saying there is a better, more American, and more effective way to do it, and here is what it is. Here's how you do it right.
Why don't we go back to Sandra for the legal and Angie for, I think these have been 2 interesting questions, and then we'll open it up again. But maybe you could ask, especially that question, and also respond to Vic as well.
Right, and so just real quickly, so it's not just a humanitarian issue, right? It's also a legal issue. And that goes to your question as well, is can the Attorney General abrogate people who have been prosecuted for illegal entry? Can they abrogate their right to apply for asylum? I guess we'd have to withdraw from the Convention Against Torture, which is incorporated into our own domestic law, specifically Article 3, which prohibits this country from returning an individual to a country where they're likely to be tortured. So we'd have to go through that process. We'd have to change the 1980 Asylum Act, which gives protection to people who are defined as refugees under national and international law. There are several bars to asylum that currently exist. For example, and one of them involves a criminal ground. If you've been convicted of a particularly serious crime, you are ineligible for asylum, and then you have to apply for an alternative called withholding of removal, where the standard is higher. So Is it possible that they could make an argument that illegal entry is a particularly serious crime? Yes, but I think it's unlikely to carry much weight given the definition of particularly serious crime. And then the other thing I wanted to mention real quick is that most of the people that are coming here have an interest in going back at some point. They want to go back. They're not here by choice. The way that our immigration laws are currently written, there's an absolute disincentive for people to leave the United States. Once you've been here illegally for more than 1 year and you leave, you're inadmissible for 10 years. That's called the 10-year bar. So this entire crisis has highlighted the need for immigration reform and for changing our laws and instituting, for example, a guest worker program.
Great. Angie?
Yeah, it's on the observation that you made, Vic, about Congress has passed laws, they've got muscle memory, why can't they do it again? So you're right, in 2013, the Senate passed with a super bipartisan majority, just let that soak in for a minute, an immigration bill. And it was an immigration bill that struck the balance that I think you were alluding to, which is, yes, we have to have limits, we have to have controls, and we have to have compassion, right? And we can do that. We can walk and chew gum. And it was legislation that said, all right, with legal immigration, rather than have people waiting in backlogs, let's address those backlogs. And when it comes to people who are coming here to work, we have a dynamic economy. But we've got the same number of visas every single year for employment law, for employment-based immigration. That doesn't make sense. We need to have a much more flexible system. It was a piece of legislation in 2013 that said, let's deal sensibly with the people who've been here without authorization. Let's have them come forward, go through background checks, show you've been paying taxes, learning English, put them on a path to citizenship, because we want people to integrate. We want them to become American, and they want to. So, and also rigorous border enforcement, which, look, gang, we already spend almost $18 billion a year at the border. So it's not like it's lax, but the legislation included that. And it passed, super bipartisan majority. And then the House, it languished, because of a very small but scary, cabal of House Republicans, now known as the Freedom Caucus, that wouldn't let it come up. So I think that there are policy prescriptions out there that find that sweet spot of control and compassion. And it's the noise now is just, it's such a high decibel level that you can't even hear it. Maybe these kids, and they're crying, right, and that our government took them, might be the moment where we could have some of that sobriety. I would like to believe that. Maybe the midterm elections could shake things up if one of the chambers was controlled by the other party. It's possible. But, in this moment, it's been tough, but I have to remain optimistic that the American public will not continue to abide by having 2,300 children taken from their mothers by our government.
Well, do you want to add anything to this? Or?
I think your argument, can go both ways. It's just immigration is a very complex issue. Immigration policy is terribly complex. And right now has been sequestered. I'm not fully convinced that Congress does not want to. I do think that they just have been able to move as forward as they can because of all the patches that people have, that governments have put onto immigration solutions. And that's the main issue. When we look at the demand for foreign labor in the United States, the outflow of people coming here because of jobs or because of insecurity, there are four issues to address. Immigration reform, recruitment. The H-2 visas for low-skilled labor can be increased. There are only 60,000 visas. And Central Americans, which represent basically 90% of the low-skilled foreign labor force in the U.S., could fill those visas through a guest worker program. Retention. Having a different type of development strategy in Central America. So the strategies exist, and the fourth one, very important, relief. it's not just a mantra that this is a nation of immigrants, but there has been a consistent approach to how to deal with humanitarian issues. The fact is, however, that there is a big difference today. That is, we moved from the securitization of immigration to the criminalization of immigration. And that's where the core of the problem is, that the current rhetoric is dominating the narrative that immigration is a criminal.
They're criminals. Yeah.
So that's what one needs to basically make an argument that that assumption is morally and politically indefensible, and legally, as Sandra was putting.
Great, thank you. Let's open it up further. Yes, we have a question back there, and then we'll go to the ambassador. Yes, please. Go ahead, we'll start with you. Just tell us.
Hi, my name
Speak up.
My name is Maria. I'm Argentinian. I'm an LLM student. And I was wondering that, thinking of the ripple effect of what this administration has been doing, you talked about bars to asylum, and there are also waivers to certain bars. So would you think the next step would be to eliminate those waivers altogether, maybe?
Thank you. Ambassador?
I'm Timothy Towell, a retired State Department officer, 30 years, most of it in this wonderful hemisphere. My question has to do with the tension that's clear in your wonderful presentations between humanitarian issues, and we're all humane, and very intellectual, scholarly lawyers. We have two humanitarians on the end. We have wonderful lawyers in the middle. But both of you sandwiched in the idea of humanity in there. There are people in this country now that don't like foreigners. That's a foreigner, especially somebody with a bad hairdo down the street here. But family was born in Germany, not Scandinavia, so that's another lie. But
Ambassador, can you try to
shut up. But the United States has had foreigners here for 500 years. Vikings first, and then I have to eat cranberry juice in Turkey in November. But those guys were Christians from Europe, from England, who were run out of the place by nasty kings. King before that dumped Catholicism because he wanted to do what Trump does with younger women. Then we had Spaniards, but they weren't the people across the border. They were here before Thomas Jefferson.
Ambassador, I can't go through all this.
And then we had...
Come on, the question.
We had Rip
Have a
Van
question?
Winkle. Everybody read about Rip Van Winkle in New Amsterdam. They were from the Netherlands. Where else did we have? Napoleon
Ambassador,
had to sell half
please.
our country.
We're going to go on.
So why don't we know that we're a country of foreigners, bad hombres?
Okay.
And by the way, I lived in Cochabamba for 2 years.
Let's go to Dean Grossman. Be ready for this one.
Ready.
Claudio Grossman.
Sandra can answer that question.
Thank you for the panel. A very pervasive narrative that has strong political implications is that the country is under assault by hundreds of thousands of people that will change the fabric of the society. And that pervasive narrative with strong political implications has captured to a certain extent the imagination of people. People feel threatened and scared. I mean, there is a narrative that all these foreigners are rapists and are criminals and so forth and so on. And then the country has full employment, it's doing well economically. And my question is this: how successful you think it has been the opposition to this policy to present other narrative, a narrative based on contributions, need to protect the borders, of course, and this is not only a humanitarian issue, already was mentioned, and so on, but from the political point of view, I think there is a bet on the fact that the immigration issue pays, and that requires to have the people scared, afraid, thinking that they way of life is under attack. I mean, I finish with this. How successful you think has been the opposition to articulate a different narrative about this problem, taking into account all its aspects?
Thank you. Let's try to get one or two other questions here in the front row here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Michelle Sternthal. I'm with Oxfam America. One area that I'm particularly concerned about is particularly after the executive order, the expansion of what you've talked about with family detention and unlimited family detention. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of a legal strategy or political strategy in terms of DHS funding. What I'm hearing right now is that DHS is going to be the authority that's going to be charged with funding the expanded family detention. And so there's issues of following the money and the dollars and whether or not there is that is a viable strategy to stop the potentially indefinite family detention. And one other thing is I think it might be useful to just expand upon the serious threat of unlimited or indefinite family detention, because I do think that point often gets lost, that the executive order in some ways bolstered the severity in terms of imprisonment. And, some of the things we've heard about the trauma for children includes not just separation, but also, being in detention.
Thank you. Yes, you had a question, right? Yeah. No, up front here. Here. In front, please.
Hello, my name is Adana Chamaki. I am with the International Affairs Department of the AFT. And my question is, what international pressure or accountability can be put on the U.S. currently, especially with us having recently withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council? So what can we do domestically, but really internationally as well?
Okay, thanks. We'll do another round. I promise we'll get to you, okay? Because we got questions over here. But let's go back to the panel. Let's maybe start with Angie, and then Sandra, and Manuel wants to say something. Angie?
Okay, so narrative. We're still very much in the beginning stages of what is a mushrooming spotlight, right, on immigration policy and what it really means in terms of what's our identity. And so it's pretty easy pickings to say that our immigration policy isn't working. It's audacious that this president has racialized this debate the way he has. And I think it makes a lot of people feel really uncomfortable. I think, the images of Charlottesville, I think talking about Mexicans as rapists, we're just in a very different time than we've ever been. As a longtime immigrant advocate, I can tell you, having been, trained by a lot of media professionals, we were always told not to call people racist because they don't like to be called racist. I get that. But I am sensing that we're in a bit of a different time now, because you can't call it anything but that. And how to begin to articulate that in a way that is constructive, that people can see a solution and not just name calling, that people who have legitimate concerns about the number of folks that come to this country, that doesn't make you a racist. If you get irritated because you have to press 2 for English, that doesn't make you a racist. It's just we're human. But I think where advocates who are fighting these intense fires, need to be able to step back and say, okay, what is a story that we can tell about this country that is true, that people can see themselves in, that's not just about the racism, but it is about the economic insecurity that people legitimately feel. It is about the healthcare costs that are skyrocketing. It is about the concern that our schools are not doing right by our kids. Those are also the issues that Americans care about, whether you're brown, black, white. And that's not what we're talking about. This administration has created this crisis at the border. We had a process for managing this. It has happened under other administrations. They have created a crisis at the border so that everyone's attention is there and not asking the hard questions about what are actually the core issues that affect us, whether you're living in Wisconsin on a farm or whether you live in Queens. So, I mean, to me, like there's something in that about just reminding them it doesn't have to be this polarized, and they're intentionally taking our eye off of what matters to all of us in a collective way. I think calling them out on that is really important. That's about as far as we've gotten on our thinking, because it's the same group of advocates that are also trying to put the fires out and protect the kids.
Thanks. Sandra?
I think in terms of narrative, I agree with everything you said. I'd like to add that for the base of this administration, the definition of who qualifies as a refugee, I don't think really speaks to them, right? And it hasn't spoken to them. I think that we in the immigrant rights community need to do a better job of highlighting the financial benefits of immigration, right? And so and we have to fight fiction with fact. So our country, this is a global world. The United States needs to retain its competitiveness. So last year, the Trump administration issued 75,000 requests for further evidence on H-1B visas. H-1B visas are temporary work visas. There aren't enough of them, but U.S. companies look for these visas because they need to bring foreign workers in order to remain competitive. And the Trump administration, through backdoor policies, is limiting the amount of foreign workers that we need and want in this country in order to maintain our competitiveness. So I think that's a point that we need to do a better job at making to the American public. Similarly, the Obama administration had set up something called the entrepreneurial parole, which would have allowed for entrepreneurs to come into the United States with a temporary parole. Again, that was stopped by the Trump administration. So I think as these policies take effect, American voters will come to see the results, and that'll be the fact instead of the fiction. There was a question about waivers. I'm not exactly sure what you meant. I think what you were saying is, should we eliminate waivers?
Sorry. Waivers are supposed to overcome the bars to asylum, so they would actually get more chances to get it. What I'm thinking is the future of this whole administration would be to eliminate them. It's not saying that I want them eliminated, the other way around, actually. But do you think it's a possibility, the way these things are going?
Right. So the waivers that the lady is talking about is for people who are subject to this 10-year bar. If, for example, they have a qualifying relative in the United States who would suffer extreme hardship if they weren't granted a waiver, those people can actually leave the United States and come back in with a waiver and consular process and come back in as green card holders. We have been wondering when that waiver policy is going to be on the chopping block. Right now, though, it's statutory, so it would require an act of Congress in order to change that law.
Interesting. Thanks. Manuel, did you want to add anything? Or?
Just to Claudio's question, I mean, in all societies, not in the U.S. only, the citizens' attitudes on immigration are divided in three groups. The very anti-immigrant perspective that is driven either by racial or nationalistic attitudes. The second one is the economicist perspective, which is immigrants are a necessary economic evil. So, I don't like them, but, the example, the most typical example is, only 4% of the U.S. labor force is in construction, but half of those people are actually foreign workers. You need them, so let's deal with it. The third group is the one that believes that immigration is a pathway towards strengthening the social capital of society. Right now, typically in the U.S. context, the U.S. compared to the rest of the world until 2016 actually had a majority of people who were in the two groups and not in this group, this anti-immigration group. Yet we never had immigration reform. And the reason was because the political capital required to have a legislation on immigration has never been there because the majority of people, the constituencies that you want to support are not citizens. So they don't have much voting rights. And so what kind of narrative you need to have to move the debate from the anti-immigrant into the other two groups is one to show the realization that we are actually a much more multi-ethnic society than we ever been in the U.S. history, and that we are actually becoming far more multicultural and multi-ethnic in the next 20 years. In fact, immigration today is more Asian-driven than Hispanic in reality. I think the narrative has to come along those lines and then defend the values and the leadership that comes with that assumption. And then, develop that narrative. Unfortunately, in the different electoral periods that we have had, at least the last 4, from Bush to Obama, very few campaign activists have actually fiercely advocated for immigration reform. They have advocated for gender rights, gender equality, for other rights, but immigration has always been the soft-spoken issue. I mean, MoveOn.org, for example, if you take a look at how many of the ads that they published during the election period, you're not going to find that not even 1 in 10 of those issues dealt with immigration reform. So now that you're confronted with this fact, because you're confronted with the values that shape the American political culture, then you're coming scratching your head, echando caspa. That's what the Ecuadorians call it, on how to figure out, to craft this message on immigration, because it's relatively new in the political spectrum.
Want to add something?
There was one question on international legal remedies
Right,
that came
Human
from
Rights
over there.
Council.
Right. So I'm not an international human rights lawyer, but I do know, for example, we were looking at filing a petition and a request for precautionary measures before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is part of the OAS, on the family separation policy. There's a group in Texas, the Texas Civil Rights Project, that did file a request for a preliminary injunction. So I know that there's that option, and it's a way, I think, looking for international venues in which we can file claims against the Trump administration makes sense for a host of reasons. They're not necessarily going to respect those decisions, but it's a way to bring pressure to bear on the administration. There's also, for example, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. I think that attorneys need to be thinking creatively about how to use these bodies to fight back.
Thank you. Let's open another round, sir. You were very patient.
Yeah, thank you.
And
John Pacheco with CBRE, First Generation Colombian. I kind of wanted to touch on a point you raised earlier.
put the microphone closer.
Is this better?
That's better.
Perfect. Sandra, I'm wearing black just at the thought of Trump appointing another Supreme Court justice. You said Anthony Kennedy stepping down may be a good thing, though. Could you please elaborate on that? Or
I don't think you said it's a good thing.
oh, okay.
I didn't say that.
Oh, I thought you said the news from Kennedy was good or something.
No.
I was like, oh, there's optimism. Not.
Nope, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, we have 2 questions here. Yeah.
That's funny.
Hi, my name is Will Hayward from Foreign Policy for America. And so tomorrow we're going to see hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. It's going to be very inspiring. But my question is, what does this actually change in the short term? Particularly with regards to Congress, how does this kind of affect pressure on people in Congress? Do we see any prospects of maybe the majority, their perspectives being changed by the public pressure, particularly in the time before the 2018 elections?
Thank you. A gentleman behind you has been patient.
Hello, I am Miguel from TV Asahi. So someone said, I don't remember who, that the administration has essentially created this problem. They didn't really focus on the issues around. I do agree with that, but something that Trump mentioned about the whole legal process is that according to the Flores Agreement, I think that's the name, kids cannot be held for more than 20 days, so they have to be released. One of the things the administration said is that they might be released with the families, but they would never come back to the court, and they would stay illegally in the country. So from a legal point of view, and from a policy point of view, how do you think this can be changed? And do you feel that there's a need to change the FROZE agreement? And how can a consensus be reached in Congress, given that it seems that there is a part of Congress that might be too focused on the short-term issue without proposing a solution, and there might be another part of Congress that may focus too much on long-term without maybe tackling the short-term issue as effectively as it should be? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, in the back there, and then we'll go to you.
Hi. Thank you for this wonderful talk. My name is Aida Romero from Clouds at American University, and I am Honduran. I don't know if you, yeah, there. So my question is, and you mentioned this, how can the U.S. put pressure on the Central American governments to improve living conditions in their countries so that people are not forced to migrate? Main sources of migration, you mentioned it, are violence, lack of food security, lack of access to health services, lack of education. So what can the U.S. do, particularly when lately the actions have been so hypocritical? For example, the U.S. accepting the re-election of the President Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, which was illegal, and, to top it all off, fraudulent. So what can the U.S. do to put pressures on corrupt countries in Honduras? And it is that the root of everything, I think, is the corruption within these countries that is leading to these terrible living conditions, this lack of security. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm an intern at the Coalition for Human Rights and Development, and I am an immigrant from Brazil. My question was actually just asked about, like, what's the role of grassroots movements and community organizing in all this when this administration is so unresponsive? And I guess to just tack on to the question, if you all are familiar with Movimiento Cosecha, I'd be interested to hear on what are your thoughts on their tactics.
Okay, thanks. No other questions? Let's go back to the panel. Angie, you want to start?
I've had the pleasure of starting first last couple times.
We'll start with Sandra.
Right, or I was thinking that
a lot of these questions.
Thinking that you could do how could the U.S. pressure Central American governments, because that's like the more international question, and then we can zoom in on the day after tomorrow and how do we move Congress like that. So that in the policy of alternatives to family detention, those feel like the three issues.
Good.
Sure.
Sorry, telling him what to do.
I think there are at least three ways to deal with this issue. One is to reintroduce a new version of the Alliance for Prosperity that has focused more on human capital development than on commodities. The second approach, the second method is that the Central American leaders need to be made more accountable. But by that meaning that they need to comply with their commitments without the moral hazard that the U.S. foreign policy establishment has followed through. That is, there is being a neglect on the side of U.S. foreign policy to recognize that these leaders are not going to comply. So that explains in part why the U.S. administration actually recognized the illegitimate the government of Honduras, the election of Juan Orlando Hernandez, knowingly that there was not only fraud, but the election itself shouldn't have happened. And the third part that is, I think, is essential is that one of the causes, but not the main cause, or the only cause, is the reluctance of the economic elites in Central America to invest and risk their businesses in the local economies. And any approach to economic development in Central America should require not only engagement by governments, but by the private sector. The reason being that you can give hundreds of millions of dollars to Central American governments, but, take education reform in Central America. The investment in education is about $200 per capita, per pupil, but you need to invest at least $10,000 per student. given the bad conditions of education in Central America, only 20% of kids actually passed any test on grammar, math, or sciences. The rest doesn't make it. Not to mention that in quantity, only 60% of kids that finish primary education actually complete secondary education. So it's just the governments themselves do not have the resources to address this problem. So you need the private sector engagement in a substantive way. So there are 3 ways to work along those lines. A new alliance for prosperity with a focus on human capital, make governments more accountable, and engage quite fiercely the private sector.
Thank you.
Do you want to do policy alternatives, family?
Let's do that, and then you can finish with what happens on Sunday.
Okay.
Why don't you go?
Well, and I think you'll have a lot to add on policy alternatives too, but there are proven alternatives to detention that are actually much less expensive. So the last statistic that I read is that it costs the U.S. government something like $308 or $10 a day to keep someone in detention, whereas these alternative programs that exist are a few dollars a day. So from a financial point of view, and again, going back to this narrative that we want to put out there, alternatives to detention make financial sense. And when you look at the statistics, the people that are in these alternative programs show up to court and they have an incentive to. Why? Because many of them have claims that are where they're likely to get relief and they're able to get an attorney. So there are these programs for alternatives. There's also, in a worst case scenario, I'm not a proponent of this, but there are even ankle bracelets. So we have clients these days in Baltimore and in Virginia who are put on an order of supervision. They're released from detention and they're put on an ankle bracelet and they're put on a monitoring program where, for example, an ICE agent will come to their house once a month or give them a phone call. If they're there, if they comply with the order of supervision, eventually the ankle bracelet is removed. And again, much less expensive than detention and much less traumatic.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. That was a great description. There have been pilot programs of these family case management systems where you've got essentially the nonprofit, the community-based organizations, and the accountability is still high, right? I mean, because now there's an institution that's also making sure that you're keeping your nose clean and that you're showing up for your court dates. So I think we can have that kind of control, and it is a much less costly and highly effective way to go as opposed to putting people in jail. So there's, I think, a slew of those kinds of ideas that, with an administration that really truly wanted to give people a fair day in court, that they could pursue them. So we'll see what happens. I think the politics and the galvanization that we've seen, in the wake of Parkland around gun violence, and we've seen it before around other issues. I mean, this issue is now rising to that level. And there is also, I think, an understanding by folks that in many ways they are connected, because of, it really is fundamentally what do we believe in? Where is it that I can see my future? And are you, an elected official, caring about that? And so I think that the degree of engagement and intensity by prospective voters is really high. I also think that investing in knocking on people's doors and making sure that they show up to vote, you can't underestimate the importance of that. So I'll stop there. I mean, I think it's a wait and see. But I was heartened by this, that there is a group of House Republican moderates that are in that kind of rare, still purple district that were working honestly really hard to try to get an immigration bill done, and that would have addressed some of these issues and would have provided protection for dreamers. And they sort of believed in the House Republican leadership that they wanted to get something done too. And they had the wool pulled over their eyes, right? There's a great analysis of how just that there wasn't that honest desire to get a bill done for these House moderates. So I think it's like they who are going to be on the chopping block, honestly. Because at the end of the day, it's like, were you with me or were you against me? Did you get the bill done or did you not get it done? And I think that kind of sharp distinction is going to change, honestly, the political map, if not in November, but certainly over time.
Well, thank you for ending on that hopeful note, Angie, because the discussion, I think, has been excellent, very realistic, a bit sobering, but I think has given us a complete and a very nuanced picture of what's going on. So I want to thank Sandra and Angie and Manuel for sharing their insights, for illuminating all of us. And I really want to thank all of you for joining today at the dialogue. And we'll continue to focus on this issue and hopefully have some of our speakers back. And because this is, as everybody I think agrees, this is going to be a continuing focus of attention moving forward on policy, and it certainly has lots of dimensions to it. And so we need to better understand it and respond in the most effective, constructive way we can. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. And